Right. Well, let me share with you, this past week I had a crisis of faith in my life. A great temptation came into my life this week, a temptation that was deeply alluring. This temptation required immense strength to overcome. And now at this point, you're probably thinking, what is going on? Is he joking? Is he serious? I'm not quite sure how to take this. Well, I thought I would go ahead and bring to you the source of temptation so you could just see it. I want to be honest about it with you, but I bring it here to you, show it to you. This is the source of temptation in my life. Spooky Halloween Oreos. Is this a temptation for anybody else? Maybe it's just me. These little circles of temptation are the devil's handiwork. I'm not sure. But gosh, they are so good. So I've shared, Oreos have made their way into many a sermon in my life. Some of you that have been here for a couple years have seen that. Well, this last week, one of our very own Connections Church attendees, they did me something nice. I'm not sure if it was nice or if they're trying to bring me down or something. I'm not entirely sure, but they gifted me this package of spooky Halloween Oreos, and I think they might be trying to bring me into temptation. I'm not entirely sure. But I'll tell you, what they know is they know I love not only Oreos, but holiday Oreos, okay? There's something about the holiday Oreos. They might be the same flavor, but there's something in that food coloring, cream filling process where they turn it orange in this case. It just makes it better. I'm not sure what it is. But the folks who gave me these Oreos, they know the truth, that there's something better about these Oreos. And they are absolutely delicious. Absolutely delicious. Now, again, I'm being silly about the Oreos. But I will tell you that Oreos, for me, sort of highlight a real temptation in my life, okay? And I will be honest with you about that. I've been gifted Oreos probably half a dozen times at least from people in the church, and I deeply appreciate the gift because they are absolutely delicious. But the thing is, I struggle with moderation when it comes to something like Oreos. I mean, really any dessert of any kind, I struggle with moderation. It's fine if I can just stick to the serving size. But I've never met anybody that, in fact, as a rule in life, like, don't trust anyone that only eats the serving size of an Oreo, right? Just kidding. It's not just like 2 or 3 Oreos, it's like a whole row of Oreos. That's what I like to enjoy. But the reason I share it with you is because it does highlight for me a real tangible temptation that I experience in my life. I've always kind of struggled with my weight throughout my life. And if you go back to like my college years, I was about 60, 70 pounds heavier, terribly unhealthy. I avoided exercise like the plague, and I made no effort at all to eat foods that are healthy. Instead, I just dove into Oreos as much as possible and everything unhealthy I could find. Truthfully, for me, the temptation of food it's a big temptation in my life. It's a battle that I experience weekly. And so, if I'm honest with you, I struggle with gluttony. Maybe others struggle with gluttony as well. I do. It's been a struggle in my life. And gluttony is one of those sins, one of those temptations that's sort of hard to pin down, right? Because food is a good thing. We sort of need it to survive. God created us to need food. He created food for us. And you read through the scriptures, you even find like feasting is a biblical practice. It's a good thing to celebrate and have a big feast, right? So So what do we do with food when we struggle with it? We know gluttony is wrong, but how do we pin down gluttony? The message is not really about gluttony today. But you see, our love for food can at some point turn into the sin of gluttony. Sort of hard to pin down. But for me, like, my journey with food has had its ups and downs, literally. Lots of ups and downs. Give you an idea, I gained more baby weight during both of my wife's pregnancies than she did. She had an excuse, I did not, right? Not a good thing. And so what I've discovered over time is that, like, Andy can have a relationship with Oreos, but moderation and control have to be part of the equation. So this temptation, it might seem silly, but this temptation of food it's a real, tangible temptation that I wrestle with often. So why do I tell you that? Well, a couple reasons. First reason is feel free to gift me Oreos, but maybe spread it out a little bit. Maybe come up with a calendar or something like that so that not everybody's bringing me Oreos at once. That's probably not a good thing for me. Again, I'm kidding about that. The real reason I tell you is because we all face temptation, right? Of many kinds. We don't like to talk about it very much. We like to come into church on Sunday acting like we have all our stuff together and that we're not tempted and that we don't struggle. But the truth is, we're all tempted. We all have our things that we are tempted with if we are going to be honest about it. We probably all struggle with different temptations, but we are all tempted, and this is one of the temptations that I experience quite a bit in my life. Now, here's the thing. Through every season, there will be a temptation to take the good things that God has created and to misuse them. In fact, I think that's kind of my definition of temptation. It's the misuse of God's creation. Like, God created it to be good, but when we twist it or misuse it, it can become sin. Food is a great thing, but the misuse of food can end up leading us to the sin of gluttony. And that's really true for really all sin, isn't it? Like, God created us to be sexual beings, and that's good. That's a good thing. But our sexuality can become twisted, and it can become sinful when we misuse God's plan for sexuality. And so that's true with just about every temptation to evil that I can think of. We began a new series last week in the New Testament letter from James. James is the brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus. And I shared with you last week that James is an incredibly practical book in the New Testament, maybe the most practical book in the New Testament. We saw last week in the first 12 verses of chapter 1 how God intends to take the trials and difficulties we experience from many different sources, and God uses those trials to develop and mature our faith. And sometimes it seems that God He allows us to go through trials. Sometimes He even sends us certain trials so as to develop our faith. Well, we're going to see a shift in James's teaching as we move into the next passage today. And James makes a distinction between trials and temptations. See, God seems to send us trials sometimes, or at least He allows us to experience trials at times. We don't always understand why or where they come from, but He uses trials to develop our faith. But James says that temptation is different. Temptation's different than a trial. James clarifies for his readers that God does not send us temptation. He might send us trials sometimes, but He doesn't send us temptation to evil. Now, certainly, overcoming temptation will develop our faith, right? But James tells us that it's different. It's different. There's a difference between trials and temptations. So James acknowledges that temptation is a reality that Christians are going to face on this side of eternity, whether we want to admit that or not. It's true. We're going to face some temptation. The big question then becomes this: how do I navigate temptation? If we know we're going to face it from all different sources, it's going to be probably different for all of us. How do we navigate temptation? So temptation tends to look different for everybody. There's certainly similarities for all of us. While I struggle with gluttony, maybe you struggle with gossip or greed, many different things we can fill in the blank there. But make no mistake, we're going to face temptation. Even Jesus was tempted. And so if we think we're not going to be tempted, if we get ultra spiritual at some point in our life, we're fooling ourselves. Temptation is a reality. Jesus faced it. We will face it. But James gives us some really practical advice on how to navigate temptation. Our main scripture is James 1, verses 13 through 18. Jerry read it earlier in the worship service. Let's dive right into verse 13. Look what James says. When tempted, kind of like last week, we saw this word when you face trials, not if you face trials. When you are tempted, not if you are tempted. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. So James distinguishes between trials and temptations. We already know that God tends to use trials in our lives, many different trials, he said last week, to develop our faith. But temptations are different. Evidently, some of James's readers wrongly believed that God is the author of temptation to sin that we experience. And so James clarifies for them right away. It's not possible for God to send you temptation to evil. Why? Well, because there's no evil in God whatsoever. And so God cannot be tempted to do evil. He's not tempted by evil because he's perfectly holy in every way. God does not tempt us toward evil. So if God doesn't tempt us toward evil, who does? Verse 14 says, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Now, even though I've said multiple times that James is a thoroughly practical book, he gets a little theological on us here. He says temptation does not come from God. Rather, we have within us we call it a sin nature. We have a bent toward evil that we're born with. We have a bent toward rebellion where there's something in us from the day we're born that sort of wants to rebel against God. Now, we're drawn toward rebellion because something is broken in us. And James clarifies, there's nothing broken in God. It's us. There's something broken in us. We have a sin nature. We have a sin problem. Now, the devil may tempt us. We find in the scripture that the devil tempted Adam and Eve. The devil tempted Job. So we know that the devil is at work tempting us. But you see, when the devil tempts us, there's an evil nature already within us that sort of agrees. You know what I'm talking about? We're tempted by something externally, but there's something internally that agrees with that rebellion and sort of wants to go a different direction because there's something broken in us. Now, the key thing I want us to focus on here that James brings out in these first few verses is the progression of temptation. James gives us a progression of temptation. And the first step in temptation, says James, is desire. Okay? We have desire for many different things. And there's nothing wrong with desire. Desire is a good thing, assuming that desire is pointed in the right direction. That's where we get in trouble, is where our desire gets pointed in the wrong direction. But then the next step after desire, James says, is enticement. Or if we want to keep the alliteration alive here, we could call it deception. After desire comes deception. And the idea that James uses here is the baiting of a hook. A fisherman covers the hook with something enticing so that the fish will take the bait, right? Fisherman wants the fish to take the hook, so he's got to cover it with something enticing, and that's the picture that James gives us here. First we have desire, and then comes deception, verse 15. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. As we've said, desire isn't wrong. And the deceptive lure of temptation in itself is not sin either. We're all going to experience that. Temptation to do evil becomes sin when I take the step of disobedience. Okay? Temptation in itself is not sin. Desire is not sin. But when I act upon that temptation, James says, it gives birth to sin when I act. See, desire sort of opens the door to temptation. And if we do not identify deception and shut it down, it's a very easy step into that action of disobedience. And so James says that this act of disobedience is sin, but there's a final step in temptation, an outcome, really, according to James. James's first metaphor is of a fisherman baiting the hook, or a hunter setting a trap. That's the image he uses. But then he introduces another graphic metaphor here. He says that when sin is full grown, sin gives birth to death. It's an awful picture. And really, it's the image of a mother giving birth to a stillborn baby. That's the image James is using for us. And we know that a mother giving birth to a stillborn baby is an absolutely heartbreaking, terrible experience that brings great anguish. And so it is with sin. Sin leads to death. That's what it does. It leads to destruction and anguish and death everywhere it goes. And that's true on this side of eternity, and it's true on the next. You see, the deceptive promise of sin and temptation is that if I buy into this sin, if I choose to misuse God's creation and I take my life this direction into sin, it's going to be pleasurable and it's going to be great. And that might be true for a short time, but it won't stay that way. And we all know that because we're all sinners and we all fall short of the glory of God. So we all have experience with sin, and we all know that when we go down that path and we buy into the lie of sin, it might start great. It might feel good. It might be exciting, but it leads to death and destruction and anguish and pain and hurt, and there is no fulfillment there to be found. We know that's true because we've all experienced it. So in these first few verses, James teaches us about how we can navigate temptation. So what's the first big takeaway? There's two big takeaways today. First one from these first few verses we already read is this: we need to shine the light on sin. We need to shine God's light on sin. As I mentioned in these first few verses, there's a progression in temptation. Temptation in itself is not sin. We're all going to face temptation. Even Jesus faced temptation. I believe it was a very real temptation that Jesus faced, by the way. And so James teaches us, temptation begins with desire. Desire opens the door to deception. And if left unchecked, deception becomes a very easy step into disobedient action, which in turn gives birth to death. Even though temptation to sin promises pleasure, we all know the truth that deception, that disobedience results in death. So up on the screen is this progression of temptation that James gives us. Desire, deception, disobedience, death. That's the progression James gives us. So what do I mean when I say we need to shine the light on sin? What in the world do I mean by that? Well, let's return to James's metaphor of baiting the hook in order to catch the fish. In order to do that, I brought another little object lesson with me today. It is not food. Unless you are a fish, then it is food. This is a tackle box. This is a fishing tackle box. And this is my son Josiah's fishing tackle box. He is more of a fisherman than I am. I've done some fishing in my life, but I'm more of a hiker than a fisher. But he loves to fish, and so this is his tackle box. And though I'm not much of a fisherman, I do know enough about fishing to know that a fisherman or fisherwoman will put some thought into the hook that they're going to use to catch the fish they want to catch. And they're going to put some thought into the bait that they're going to put on that hook in order to catch the fish they want to catch. Why? Well, because as far as I know, not a lot of fishermen out there catch fish with a hook alone, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's not possible. Maybe you have a story of how you caught a fish one time with just a hook, and I'm sure that's possible, but it's certainly not common. I mean, that's a reason we have bait. There's a whole industry based around bait that you can buy overpriced from Scheels to put on your hook, right? Why? Because the hook by itself is not that enticing to the fish, right? Now, I'm no fish psychologist. I don't know if there is such a thing as a fish psychologist. But I would venture to say that from the perspective of a fish, if they see a metal, sharp, pokey-looking thing floating around in the water, and they see that, they're not thinking, wow, that looks delicious. I don't think they're thinking that. They're thinking, that looks dangerous. I should stay away from that hook because I don't want it to lead to my death, right? I don't know if that's exactly what goes through a fish's mind when they see just the hook in the water. The fisherman puts the bait on the hook so as to cover up the hook, to conceal the reality of the destruction this is about to bring to the fish, right? The whole reason is to entice the fish. The whole reason is to bait the fish into taking the hook. So why do I share that illustration? Well, sin, temptation is a whole lot like that. It's a whole lot like that. If we consider the hook to be sin, we know that the sin itself is going to cause some damage in our life. That's why sin is always covered up with deception. It's the bait. It's the enticing, deceptive bait that covers over the reality of sin. Makes it look better than it is. It makes it look delicious. It makes it look fun. All those things. And then we buy into the lie of sin. That is the hook. And then we regret it at some point. Because we discovered that, yes, it did lead to destruction and death and hurt and pain. And it promised fulfillment and pleasure, but it did not lead to fulfillment and pleasure. It led to anguish. It led to destruction and death. You see, when I say we need to shine the light on sin, what I'm getting at is we need to remove deception. We need to slow down and really think about the temptation that is set before us. And we need to remove the deception so that we can begin to see sin for what it is. Because when I see sin for what it is, when I see the death and the destruction that this hook of sin is going to bring into my life, it makes that sin not quite as alluring as it used to be. So how can we make application here? Well, we've got to start calling out sin for what it is. It's evil and destructive. And if we're going to misuse God's good creation and choose to sin, it's going to bring destruction into our lives. We've got to call it what it is. When we experience temptation, and we will experience temptation, we've got to remove those deceptive lies to reveal the destructive realities. So for all of us, I want us to be thinking about this today. Are there any deceptive lies that we're buying into? You know, the enemy is a smart, cunning enemy. He's very smart. And he knows how to bring temptation into our life that's very subtle and small. And we think like, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But no, it is a big deal. And we need to call sin for what it is. So relating this back to my struggle with food, I have found in my own life with my temptation of food that it's really helpful if I identify where the sin of gluttony in my life will lead me. For example, if I eat bacon cheeseburgers every day and rows of Oreos, though they may be delicious, and they are, what I know is that I'm going to feel like garbage, and I know it's going to lead to a poor quality of life. It's going to negatively affect all of my relationships. Eventually, I won't be able to, throw the football with my son or ride the bike with the kids, that sort of thing. It'll negatively impact my marriage, and it will probably lead to an early death. And so when I put the reality on the situation, I remove the deception a little bit, all of a sudden Oreos for breakfast don't sound as alluring as maybe they used to. And that's the kind of thing we need to do with the temptations that are set before us. It's not about just making us feel really bad because we're tempted. We are tempted. And gosh, I really hope and pray that Connections Church would be the kind of place where we can be honest about the temptations that we face and just recognize that we're all in this together. We all face temptations, and we all need to remove the deception from sin that is set before us. And so that leads me to this second piece here, because it's one thing to just remove the deceptive lure of temptation, but it's hard to know what is counterfeit if we don't know the truth. You know that? It's difficult to spot a counterfeit if you don't know the real thing. So the second answer I want to share with you is this: seek the sustainer. We need to shine God's light on sin, but then we need to seek the sustainer. Look at verses 16 and 17. James says, "Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." The lesson is really pretty simple here. James is teaching us now that God does not send us bad gifts. He sends us good gifts. He does not tempt us to sin. He doesn't tempt us toward evil, because there's nothing that's evil in him at all. And because sin leads to death. No, James says God gives good gifts. So there's a few lessons here that James gives us about good gifts. And the first one is, again, God gives good gifts. For example, God's plan for relationships and sexuality is a good plan. And his plan will bring life and fulfillment. But Satan goes about twisting God's good plan. Satan's pathway leads to heartache and destruction. Secondly, the idea here in the Greek is that God will continually give good gifts. It's not that he gives a good gift just one time. No, he keeps on giving good gifts. And lastly, this good God of ours, he doesn't change. Like, there's a dark side of the moon, but there's no dark side in our God. And so we can keep going back to our good God because there's nothing dark or evil in him at all. And when we know that he wants to keep giving us good gifts, we can always go back to him. We don't have to wait until he's in a good mood. We go back whenever we want because he cares about us and he's immeasurably good. So let us seek the sustainer. Verse 18 closes out the passage we're looking at today. James says, he chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. If you have your own Bible with you or on an app or something like that, you should highlight those first two words. He chose. He chose. You know, he did not have to give you and I salvation. He didn't have to do that. He chose to redeem you. He chose to send his only son, Jesus, to become the means by which we can be redeemed and reconciled to God. He chose. James says, he chose to give you a new birth through the word of truth. What in the world do you mean by the word of truth, James? A couple things here. This concept of the word of truth, I think it's a rather big concept. First, we know that God created the heavens and the earth by the power of his creative word. Furthermore, we know that Jesus Christ is the Word made flesh, and we also know that the Word of God, the Scriptures, are a gift to God's people, inspired and preserved by God's Spirit. There's a lot packed into this concept of word of truth. So what's the point, Andy? Well, our good God chose. He chose to give us a new birth through the immeasurable power of his truth. He chose to give us a new birth. So we're talking about the power of the God who created the heavens and the earth, all the mountains and oceans and everything that lives and breathes on our planet. He's the God who created all of that by the power of his creative word. And so we think for a moment that, boy, God can't help me with this. Oh, you mean the God that created all that? So let us remind ourselves every time we see those beautiful mountains next to us that the God who did that is the God who has the power to produce in us a new birth through the power of the word of truth. And furthermore, the God who sent his own son, who is perfect, to die on a cross, he became like us. He willingly came and lowered himself so as to redeem us. He rose from the dead. Like resurrection power is available to us to conquer sin and temptation? You bet. And you're saying that the word of truth, like the written word of truth, should encourage us? Absolutely. Because when I read the scriptures and you read the scriptures, we come along stories of men and women that went before us that experience the same kinds of temptation we experience. And we're a little bit encouraged because we realize, oh, wow, man, they screwed it up just like I screwed up. But then we see, wow, they overcame by the power of the word of truth. So that gives me some hope that I can overcome as well. He chose. He chose to give you a new birth through the power of the word of truth. And there's a lot packed into that concept of the word of truth. So James gives us this just fantastic guidance on how we can go about navigating temptation. We need to shine the light on sin. We got to call it what it is, okay? We need to remove the deception, identify where our sin will lead us, and we need to seek the sustainer. We can't do it without him. And we got to get back to his truth so we can spot the counterfeits that are all around us. And if we do, I promise you, we will find hope if we seek him. We will find that great shepherd of the faith that longs to lead us and guide us and help us overcome. And he will. So Dan's going to come back up and just play just for a couple of minutes here at the end. And so I want us to just kind of quiet our hearts, bow our heads, close our eyes, and I just want to give us just a little bit of space today as we close the message to just reflect on this passage. You know, for some of you, perhaps you know that there's some sin in your life right now that you're involved in, whatever it is, and you know it's bringing death into your life and your relationships. And maybe you're finally just kind of fed up with that, and you're ready to walk away from that life of rebellion, and you're ready to start following Jesus. Well, this reflection moment or two here would be a great moment for you to turn to Jesus in faith, turn away from sin and commit your life to following him. But I think there's many others here today that, hey, you know you're a Christian. You know you've placed your faith in Jesus, but you also know that there's some temptation that you've been saying yes to. There's some deception that you know it's deception, but you've been allowing and kind of inviting that deception into your life. And maybe you just know, gosh, I just need to seek the Lord. I need to repent. Maybe I need to call some godly, wise people that I trust into my life to help me. But most of all, gosh, this would just be a good time for you to invite the God who created all things. Invite him into that conversation. He would like to be part of that conversation. So invite him into your story, into your struggle, and he will help you. Let's shine the light on temptation, and let's seek the sustainer, and he will help us overcome. Let's just take a few moments to pray on our own and just reflect on what we've talked about today.